Our ability to be able to deter others, irrespective of where they come from, and showing our commitment to that and our resilience of every single person in Europe to this form of aggression or any form of attack. These are the conditions under which peace can prevail. And that's why we do this.
Welcome to EU Defence Declassified, brought to you by the European Defence Agency. This is our podcast where we try to demystify the different ways that EU countries work together in defence. I'm Robin Emmett, and alongside me is my colleague Liga Lagstinia.
Welcome, and today we're discussing what it takes to coordinate military priorities across all 27 member states. We are joined by General Seán Clancy, the chair of the European Union Military Committee.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and wonderful to see you both here today.
Thank you. General Clancy, this year the EU's Military Committee celebrates 25 years. Could you start by explaining what the EU Military Committee actually does and how it's different from, say, the military staff or NATO's Military Committee?
Great question to start with, because I think one of my jobs as the chair of the EU Military Committee is actually part of my external engagement is to, I won't say educate, but to actually inform, I guess, those institutions here in Europe, members of the public and the wider, I suppose, environment about what it is that the Military Committee actually does. It was formed, as you said, 25 years ago now. And the Council at that time, I think they realised that there was a gap in their understanding and their appreciation. And during that period in the early 80s as well, we saw the commencement and the continuation in some respects of military operations, missions and operations and training as we see now. And they had a gap in their, I suppose, their advices and their understanding here in the EU. And they decided to form the Military Committee. And the job of the committee is to form really engagement with the institutions. I sit in the structure of the Council. My primary role is to obviously advise the High Representative and the Vice President. But that is not as simplistic as it sounds, because even today, as we know, the journey of military operations and missions and training over 25 years has changed significantly. In a very simple language, I could say that the Military Committee forms the bridge between those operations and missions and the political will and ambition.
But only for the EU. So we talk sometimes about Europe and people might mix up EU, NATO, but your role is specifically EU, right?
Oh, absolutely. There is a distinction and there is not a competition. A very strong focus for me as a chair is to try and create this wider understanding that we really do need to be in concert. There has to be a complementarity between NATO and between the EU in particular. And we see this more and more. We see this being stated by the High Representative. We see Commissioner Kubilius. We see the President of the Commission, the President of the Council, all on the same line in this. And we see also from NATO a similar reciprocity in terms of this understanding the need for more complementarity in terms of our work. The EU is the soft power. The NATO is perhaps the hard power. My role is more than just within the institutions. I have a role externally engaging with that relationship with NATO and with other partners, third countries, third partners, with the Ukraine, for instance, Defence Contact Group, and what relationships we have with those and many other actors that sit in this defence and security domain today. That domain has expanded significantly in 25 years. I think the forefathers in 2001 that formed the Military Committee at that time or perhaps would be sitting back now and wondering how did we get to the point we are today, where we went from perhaps an advisor or two to a whole cabinet that sits here to try and generate, inform and keep a really strong military advice into firstly the High Representative Vice President, but the wider institutions. My main, I suppose, area and place that I situate that in the first instance is with the Political and Security Committee, which is obviously chaired, and I, as the chair of the Military Committee, have a seat at that committee, and that is made up of the 27 member states' ambassadors. And my Military Committee then is made up of the military representatives of the 27 EU member states sitting here in their permanent representations in Brussels. Each of them has a military representative, an advisor, and a senior person on that, who's generally a high-ranking general, sits on the Military Committee. So it's a very high-level strategic advisory body, and there is no shortage of work.
And if we imagine for a second, what would EU defence look like without EUMC?
That's hard to envisage because, I wasn't here in 2001, so it would be great to have a reflection to see back. But let me see forward and let me tilt that a little bit and look at it from a glass half full point of view. What does it look like with the military committee? And when I look at that, I often question myself, where can we add value? So a clear example right now, people will understand, is that we're in a very significantly changed strategic, geopolitical and geostrategic environment. Defence and security is the number one priority, I think we can all agree, right across the EU institutions right now. That wasn't the same 5 years ago, and certainly not the same 25 years ago, but today it is. And the added value that the EU Military Committee can bring is that, firstly, it bridges between the political level of ambition and then getting the right advice to ensure that the resources can meet the tasks that come from that ambition. So I guess just to put this into simple language, if you like, we have to have capabilities to meet our tasks. So we all know that we have a mission now in the Red Sea. It's called Operation Aspides. And the resources that member states need to supply to that for it to do it and complete its mandated tasks that the political have given it. And my job is to actually advise with regards to the political and try to ensure that the military staff under the EUMS can carry out the tasks that are given through the operational commander. And the military staff can then, do the staff work that's required in many cases, not necessarily in the SBDs. And the military committee it's an entity that is constantly evolving in terms of how it executes its role. I have my vision that I have laid down and set out a number of objectives under my tenure for the period of time that I will be here, which is a 3-year term. And under that term, I set myself some goals. And we set about our work to achieve those, while at the same time carrying out the work that's set down by the Political and Security Committee in particular. So, for example, building on the relationship between the EU and NATO would be one. Having a very simple, coherent command and control system from the EU down to the missions and operations and many other areas, but also building the capabilities and the understanding from the member states, building on the coherence between the member states and the political will here in the EU. All of these things are funneled, if you like, through the cabinet in terms of the military advisory piece.
Thank you very much. And General, I've read that in the past, the EUMC has been defined, or that it works as kind of a military diplomacy. Is that true? And also, what does that mean exactly?
Yes, it is true. But it's true because a soldier is always required to be a diplomat. If you look at the triumvirate that we would always train in, is a soldier, a scholar, and a diplomat. And there's a rationale behind that, because a decision that a soldier makes can often resonate with political implications. And the awareness of the political environment in the first instance is important. But also then as you get to positions like I am fortunate to hold, you have to engage with many internal, external and wider partners, and all coming from different perspectives and different understandings and different perhaps motivations. And therefore it takes a high level of diplomacy to try and build on a consensus, an achievable consensus, to make progress and bring things faster and more efficiently forward. And my mindset remains always the same. I have to represent the voice of the 27 chiefs of defence across the member states. And firstly, getting that internal audience in terms of consensus requires diplomacy, but then translating that and transmitting that in forms of military advice and informing the political body with regards to the will or the actual advices of the CHODs takes this diplomacy, and it takes an ability to be able to transfer that and translate it into the political domain.
And also there's this issue of the EU always working at 27. I imagine it's hard to get consensus quickly and take decisions quickly. How's that been like for you in these difficult times?
Well, 27 member states are unique because it is a strength that we build on a consensus-based basis. It's what our treaties are based on. It's what it sets us apart. We have a commonality of values and purpose set out in our treaties. And then that consensus is a strength. And of course, others would look at that as a weakness. But the fact that we can build consensus, and a term we use here in the military committee amongst our team all the time, unity doesn't mean uniformity. And that comes from the fact that every individual member state is individual. But we understand what collectivism is. We understand mutual support. And we understand the need to make progress. And when challenges come to that unity, we have to, either internally or externally, we have to gather together to form a consensus basis on how we see is the correct path to address it. And that doesn't matter if you're dealing with the most simplex of issues in terms of the EU or the most complex of issues, which of course we're now facing in terms of the existential threat we face as a continent.
Now, of course, EU defence doesn't only happen in Brussels. As of today, if I'm right in my research, 9 EU military operations and missions are ongoing. And since 2003, there have been 19 military operations and missions conducted. So I guess I was curious to know, how do you see such missions evolving, especially as the EU looks to be faster and more decisive?
You've done your homework, which is good. We have 9 right now, and they have evolved over time from the common security and defence policy point of view. And Europe has taken a wider lens, if you like. We've understood the need to go to areas where issues start from source. It forms the wider strategic approach by the EU. For example, some of the training missions, the support missions we would have in the African continent, or some of those in the wider Middle East, where the EU understands what happens in these areas and regions affects how we do our business here in Europe. And therefore we have a strategic imperative and a strategic interest to be involved and to be engaged, because what's in our interests is in other interests. But that has evolved over time into an understanding that this is a mutually beneficial arrangement, that we need to listen to our partners with where we are providing these operations and missions, and that we have to understand the domain, we have to understand the geographical location, and we have to understand the cultures. And I think the integrated approach which the EU has now evolved into sees a wider, more holistic view in terms of all of the pillars, if you like, of institution building, of economic building, of trade building, and of the instruments of the military in terms of its stability and stabilization capacity. All of these things have been brought to bear. But bringing it in an integrated, holistic manner is what the EU needs to do more of. And I think this is how we've seen an evolution of the common security and defence policy, and this should continue, in my view. We have 3 missions at the moment, and we have 6 other training missions. EUMM Ukraine, I suppose, is the most commonly understood and known of these. And even in that, we've had to evolve with our partners. We have to listen to the needs and adjust with how we deliver. And that's what we do, and we continue to do that.
That's the one training Ukrainian troops on EU soil.
Correct, yes. And of course, there are many different institutions that are providing this. NSATU, which is the NATO arm, if you like, of doing this. You have a UK involvement. You have as I said, you have the Ukrainian Defence Contact Group. So you have many different groups that are providing supports to Ukraine. And it's important from the EU and EUMAM's perspective, which at this point we have trained upwards of 85,000 soldiers for Ukraine in different theatres. Our 2 principal areas of support come within the geographical area of Poland and of Germany in terms of centres. Only yesterday the Political and Security Committee visited our centre in Germany, provided, of course, by the German Armed Forces, which is, has proved hugely beneficial. But we're constantly looking and examining of what it is we're providing. We are engaged fully with our Ukrainian counterparts to make sure we're meeting their needs, and that changes and has changed over the period of nearly 4 years of war now, and we will continue to do, and hopefully and ultimately in preparation and in planning for a time beyond war. And this is really the ultimate goal for everybody.
And one of the big initiatives linked to this idea of defence readiness is the EU's rapid deployment capacity. For those of us who might not be so familiar with it, could you tell us a bit about it, and how will it help the EU respond faster and more effectively when crises happen?
What it's not is an EU army. And this is a common misnomer sometimes, that we're forming EU armies. We're not. This is an instrument that has been formed as a consequence of the strategy of the EU, which came out of the March 2022 Strategic Compass. So that was like a white paper, if you like, that a national government would form. So it was the white paper for the EU, if you like. And out of that, they had 4 parts, and one of those was ACT. And part of the ACT was an instrument so that the EU had something within its capacity to react instantly to crisis when they arise and where the EU saw it's fit to do it. So people may be familiar with the old structure called a battle group. Well, the rapid deployment capacity is about having battle groups, yes, but also having modules that nations and member states can provide. So it's not one big capacity and that's deployed at an instant. It is in response to the particular crisis. And in the modular approach can allow the EU to, I suppose, create a bespoke system and a bespoke structure to respond to that particular crisis. When we spoke about NATO and the EU earlier on, it's not to be confused or conflicted with anything that NATO would do, say, under Article 5 or otherwise. That's really in the defence and deterrence realm. And NATO have absolute responsibility when it comes to defence and deterrence. This is about common security and defence policy. It's about crisis management and responding to crisis, which can happen as a consequence of climate, which we see through fires, which we see through flooding. It can happen through some form of breakdown in terms of democracy on the continent or otherwise. So there's many forms that it can take. And therefore, what capacity has the EU to respond quickly and responsibly? And the RDC forms part of that response. That's the military arm, if you like. And of course, we have some very active civil missions in the CSDP role as well. So it's a combination of all of these things that empowers and supports and really underpins the strategy in terms of the EU, in terms of its overall approach to CSDP.
But the rapid deployment capacity is real, right? It trains regularly, there are regular exercises?
Absolutely, it is real. And we have a battle rhythm and a tempo set up, which is a rotational basis of who will lead it. There's preparatory exercises, then there are standby exercises. The timeline under which you are on standby changes over the period of 1 year for any particular lead nation. This has been stood up for the first time in 2025, and Germany are leading this, with many other countries supporting them in terms of the modular approach. And this will change next year. Each lead has a 12-month commitment, and every 6 months there will be an overlap. And you'll have those that are overlapping will be going through preparatory exercises and then going on full standby. And the full standby is up to an alert status of being able to deploy within 10 days ultimately.
And to go back to a bit about what you said at the beginning about your role as chairman, if this force was ever to be deployed abroad, I imagine you'd be involved in taking that political decision or at least giving advice around it.
That's exactly the nail on the head, Robin. That's exactly it. My role in this instance will be to advise the Political and Security Committee and the HRVP in terms of the appropriateness, in terms of the type of approach or the modules to use and what would be most appropriate for the crisis response under question. And all of those will form a military advice, and that military advice is built on the consensus and understanding of all of 27. So this is where the strength of the uniformed approach and unified approach comes.
Thank you very much. That's a lot to take in, also very insightful. A final question, if I may. The EU needs to be able to defend itself against Russia with or without the United States. Assessments by, for example, NATO, Germany, Poland, Denmark, also the Baltic states, put Russia as ready to attack within 3 to 10 years span. What will it take for the European Union to be ready for this?
This is a very appropriate question given the environment that we now find ourselves in. And there is a wider common understanding that it's not about the timeline of Russia, it's about our own capabilities, our own preparedness. And the Preparedness Union strategy, which the EU has published, is based about preparedness, and two parts of that in particular, our resilience and our readiness. And that goes across the whole of society, not just the military. Because the threats and the risks that we face now, and yes, Russia is one of those significant threats, but we have the hybrid space where there's many threats come from, which can affect any particular individual member state. They are borderless and they're non-discriminatory. And therefore, every member state has to take seriously the threats that it can and must prepare for. And the whole of society needs to be ready and have a degree of resilience. And when we talk about resilience, it's not only preparedness, it's about redundancy. It's about a capacity to respond and to protect and to maintain the way of life, their democratic way of life, but their physical way of life as well, their economic structures and so on. But going back to your primary question, of course, is what we face in terms of the threat from Russia. And we have seen for the last 4 years an evolution, if you like, in military doctrine as a consequence of what we are learning from the war on Ukraine. This illegal, immoral invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen a Russian armed forces that has obviously learnt. We see Ukrainian armed forces that are learning every single day in the most atrocious circumstances, but are responding and showing an extraordinary level of resilience to the point of the whole nation's resilience. In Ukraine, I think we are all very much admire. But this has, from a new point of view, after perhaps 2 to 3 decades of living in a space where we did not prioritize defence and security, perhaps in the post-Cold War era, we weren't as attentive to our capabilities. And as a consequence, we recognize the gaps we now have. And therefore, we're addressing those in order to be prepared. And of course, why do we prepare in this way? We prepare to create the conditions for peace to prevail. Because without deterrence and without the capacity to deter, then you're increasing the risks of peace breaking down. And therefore, building up our capacities in Europe and our ability to be able to deter others, irrespective of where they come from, and showing our commitment to that and our resilience of every single person in Europe to this form of aggression or any form of attack. These are the conditions under which peace can prevail. And that's why we do this.
Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there, but it's been a real pleasure to have you on. And thank you for sharing some of your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you both for coming in. It's great.
That brings us to the end of today's episode, and actually the end of Season 3. We hope you enjoyed EU Defence Declassified. For more information on our work, visit EDA's website at eda.europa.eu and check out our magazine, European Defence Matters. The 30th edition just launched. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next season.